He never meant to sleep with a stranger. Grayson Wolf was not the kind of man who made mistakes. As the billionaire CEO of Wolf Dynamics, his empire was built on precision, discipline, and the certainty that every part of his life served a purpose. From the stocks he picked to the people he allowed into his private world, everything had a calculated return. Emotional distractions were never part of the equation. So when he woke up in the penthouse suite of the Ritz-Carlton and saw a faint smear of blood on the pristine white sheets, a cold realization settled in his chest. Not fear, not guilt, just a sharp awareness that something had broken protocol, and he did not know how or why. Beside him, a young woman lay curled up, her back to him, her breathing shallow, not the type of woman who usually shared his bed. No designer perfume lingered in the air, no trace of lipstick on the glasses. Her presence was quiet, almost ghost-like, as if she was trying to disappear into the sheets. Her dress, crumpled and torn at the hem, lay discarded on the floor near his jacket. A silver tray sat nearby, the champagne untouched, the strawberries still glistening with condensation. The entire scene looked like it belonged in a cheap drama. Except this was his reality, and the blood on the bed was real. She stirred slightly, wincing as she moved, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket, and when she turned to face him, her eyes were wide with something between fear and shame. Dark lashes wet from tears that had long dried, her lips parted, but no sound came out until he asked, his voice low and steady, "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Eva," her voice hoarse, almost fragile, as if even saying her name was too heavy to bear. And in that moment, Grayson noticed how small she looked, not just physically, but in the way she held herself, as though life had taught her to stay invisible, to not take up space. "How did you end up in my room?" he asked again, still trying to make sense of the pieces, and she said she worked at the hotel. "Just room service. Someone told her to deliver food to room 660, but the numbers on the doors had been swapped. She didn't know it was his suite, didn't know she'd walked into something meant for someone else." He studied her face, her trembling hands, her eyes that never quite met his, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't a game, this wasn't a setup, and she wasn't lying. No one would fake what he saw on those sheets. No one would cry themselves to sleep in the bed of a billionaire if they had planned it. She started to gather her clothes, avoiding his eyes, saying she would leave, asking only that he not report her, not ruin what little she had left. And she moved to the door, every step a silent plea to disappear. He could have let her go, could have turned away and filed this night under a mistake, but something stopped him. Not pity, not desire, something deeper, something unfamiliar. And before she touched the doorknob, he said, "Wait." She paused, her fingers freezing midair, and when she turned to face him, her expression unreadable, he realized he was about to say something no version of himself had rehearsed. And yet the words came, steady, quiet, undeniable. "You're not going anywhere." It wasn't a threat. Not even a command. It was a decision, made from the kind of place in a man's soul that he doesn't know exists until someone opens the door without asking. And from that moment on, neither of them would ever be the same. Ava Mae Carter had learned from a young age that silence was a kind of survival in the trailer park just outside San Antonio where she grew up. Noise only brought trouble. Men who shouted too loud and women who cried too much never lasted long. Her mother used to whisper to her before falling asleep, saying, "Mija, keep your head down and your mouth closed, and maybe the world won't chew you up." Eva took that advice and wore it like armor through every foster home, every part-time job, every broken promise that followed her into adulthood. Now, at 23, she lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, shared with her teenage brother Mateo, who had diabetes and a smile that could still light up her world. She worked 3 jobs just to keep the electricity on and the insulin stocked. One of them was cleaning rooms at the Ritz-Carlton, Manhattan, under a name that wasn't hers. Because her real identity came with baggage she couldn't afford to carry, The courts didn't care that she had fought back when a man twice her size cornered her behind the restaurant she once worked at. All they saw was a brown girl with no father and a record that made her look like trouble. Grayson Wolf had never been to Brooklyn, never stood in a dollar store wondering if you could stretch $10 into dinner and bus fare and a bottle of Tylenol. He was born in Greenwich, Connecticut, raised behind gates taller than ambition, the son of Gregory Wolf, the third-generation chairman of Wolf Dynamics, a company that started with steel and morphed into tech, then logistics, then everything else money could touch. Grayson graduated from Princeton with honors at 20, launched a startup at 22, acquired his first unicorn by 25, and was named CEO of the family empire 2 years later after his father suffered a stroke on the golf course. People called him ruthless, brilliant, impossible to read. Women called him cold, intense, sometimes addicting. He lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, drove a matte black Aston Martin, attended charity galas where the wine cost more than Ava's yearly rent, and never allowed anyone too close, not out of fear, but because feelings were unpredictable, and unpredictable was dangerous. Still, he wasn't cruel, just precise. He liked order, systems, boundaries, and what happened that night with Eva had no place in any of them. Even now, days later, he found himself distracted by the memory of her eyes, not their shape or color, but the way they looked at him, not with awe or calculation, but confusion. Like she didn't understand why someone like him would speak gently, why he didn't yell or call security or press charges. He had looked her up, of course, or tried to, but the name she gave him didn't pull any official employee records, and that unsettled him, not because he thought she lied, but because it meant she had something to hide, and Grayson didn't like what he couldn't define. Meanwhile, Eva tried to return to normal life, pretending that the most surreal night of her existence hadn't happened, that her body didn't still remember his hands or the way his voice changed when he said her name. She avoided the Ritz floors, where the luxury suites were, switched shifts with a coworker to stay in housekeeping rather than food service, but it didn't help, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw him sitting up in that bed, shirtless, confused, and suddenly kind. She knew she had to stay away, not just because he belonged to a world she couldn't survive in, but because people like him didn't do second chances, and women like her didn't get fairy tales. She didn't need him to pity her, and she definitely didn't need his charity. All she needed was to stay under the radar until she saved enough to move Mateo out of the city, somewhere with trees and sunlight and schools that didn't smell like mold. But fate, or maybe something more dangerous, had other plans, because 1 week after that night, Grayson showed up in the service hallway of the hotel, dressed not in a suit but in jeans and a gray hoodie, his presence so absurdly out of place that the cleaning staff stopped what they were doing just to stare. Eva dropped her mop when she saw him, her heart lodging itself somewhere near her throat. She didn't speak, but he did, saying quietly, "We need to talk." She thought about running, really thought about it, but instead she followed him out the back door and into the alley, where their story, for better or worse, was only just beginning. Eva stood in that alleyway with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, not because of the cold, but because of the man in front of her. Grayson looked like someone who had never known how it felt to be powerless, yet in that moment, she could see something unsettled in his eyes, something he was trying very hard to mask with calmness and control. He didn't start with an apology, didn't offer money or explanations. He just asked if she was all right. The kind of question that sounded simple but weighed heavy in her chest. She wanted to laugh or cry or scream, maybe all at once, but she said nothing. Instead, she asked why he was here. He told her he had been thinking about her every day since that night, that something about her didn't make sense, and that he hated when things didn't make sense. She could have been insulted, but she wasn't, because the way he said it wasn't cruel, it was confused, as if she were a problem he couldn't solve, and that both intrigued and scared him. She told him he shouldn't be here, that someone would see them, that a man like him didn't belong in alleys and a woman like her didn't belong in his world. He didn't argue, he just said that maybe the world needed to bend a little. Over the next few weeks, they saw each other in secret, not often, and never in places with lights or names. Grayson would find ways to bump into her at the hotel's back corridors, sometimes pretending to be there for logistics inspections, sometimes just waiting in silence until she noticed him. At first she resisted, but eventually she stopped pretending she wasn't waiting for him too. They talked more than touched, their conversations strange and sharp, her stories full of grit and survival, his full of boardrooms and battles he had no business winning at such a young age. She told him about her mother, about Mateo, about the time she almost got kicked out of school for defending a girl who didn't speak English. He told her about his father's expectations, about the pressure of being perfect, and how most nights he sat in his penthouse wondering what part of his life was actually real. One night, they met on the hotel rooftop, where she brought leftover pastries from the kitchen, and he brought a blanket and 2 cups of black coffee. It was stupid and cold and beautiful. She looked up at the New York skyline and said it made her feel small. He said it made him feel alone. And then, without thinking too hard, she leaned into him, and he let her, for once not pushing the moment away. He kissed her, not with hunger but with hesitation, as if afraid he might break something fragile, and she kissed him back with that same fear, as if love was something you had to hold gently or it might slip through your fingers. Neither of them called it love yet, but it was already forming, quietly, dangerously, under the surface. The next morning he called her, not just to say good night or good morning, but to ask something impossible. He wanted her to pretend to be his girlfriend for one weekend. His family was hosting their annual winter charity gala in upstate New York. It was a closed event, full of donors and potential investors, and his grandmother had threatened to arrange another blind date if he didn't bring someone. He didn't want a woman in diamonds and lies. He wanted someone real. Eva laughed at first, thinking he was joking, then panicked, thinking he was serious. She said no, he said he'd pay her. She said that wasn't the point. He said it wasn't about money, it was about trust, that he didn't trust anyone else to stand next to him without pretending, and that she didn't have to be anyone but herself, which was the most dangerous part. She said yes only because Mateo's medical bills were rising and her second job had just been cut. She packed the one decent dress she owned, borrowed a pair of heels from a coworker, and rode in silence next to Grayson in the back of a sleek black SUV, through snowy roads lined with pine trees and mansions she had only seen in movies. The Wolf estate looked like a castle, white stone, endless windows, and staff that moved like shadows. His grandmother greeted her with cool politeness, his cousins stared like she was a museum piece, and his father, partially recovered from the stroke, examined her with an expression that said he knew exactly where she came from, and didn't approve. Eva held her ground, smiled politely, and stayed close to Grayson, who never left her side unless he had to speak, and even then he kept glancing her way as if checking that she hadn't vanished. She played the role well, not because she wanted to impress, but because she had been surviving her whole life, and this was just another kind of battlefield. That night, after the speeches and champagne, after the waltz she barely managed without tripping, Grayson took her hand and led her to the library, a quiet room with high ceilings and older books than most public schools. He sat down, pulled her gently onto his lap, and said thank you, not just for coming, but for not running. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy under the billionaire, someone tired and searching, someone who wanted to be seen. She asked him why her, out of everyone, and he said because she made him feel like more than what he was born into, like he had earned something for once, not bought it, not inherited it, just earned it. And in that moment she realized she was no longer pretending. Back in her room that night she stared at her reflection and didn't see a poor girl or a housekeeper. She saw someone worthy of being loved, and that terrified her more than anything else in the world. The next morning began like something out of a different life. Ava woke in a guest room bigger than her entire apartment. the sheets softer than anything she had ever touched. Sunlight poured through tall windows framed by velvet curtains. She moved slowly, quietly, afraid that if she made too much noise, the illusion would shatter and someone would walk in to tell her she didn't belong there. But no one did. She found Grayson in the kitchen, wearing a gray sweater and pouring coffee like it was something he did every morning, not like a man who belonged to boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers. He smiled when he saw her, a small, real smile that made her chest tighten. She sat down, accepted the coffee, and for a brief moment allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be more than a borrowed fantasy. That illusion didn't last. After breakfast, Grayson left to take a business call, and Eva wandered the estate, hoping to avoid curious eyes. She ended up near the art gallery, a long hallway filled with portraits of wolf ancestors and early sketches from famous painters. At the end of the hall stood an older man with a cane, tall, sharp-eyed, and clearly waiting for her. When he introduced himself as Thomas Wolfe, Grayson's uncle and former CFO of the company, his tone was pleasant but cold, like ice in whiskey. He asked her where she grew up, what her parents did, how long she had worked at the Ritz, questions meant to look polite but felt like knives under her skin. She answered as best she could, choosing which truths to leave out, but he wasn't satisfied. He told her she reminded him of someone, a woman who once came to the estate decades ago, claiming to be in love with his brother. He said women like her had a way of appearing out of nowhere, attaching themselves to powerful men, always with a sad story and soft voice, and that in the end, they always disappeared, leaving damage in their wake. Eva didn't respond, didn't flinch, just met his stare and said she had no intention of damaging anything. She was only here for a weekend. She would be gone soon enough. He nodded, smiled without warmth, and said he hoped she would keep her word. That night, Eva stood alone on the balcony, the wind cold against her bare arms. She had dressed up for the gala, wearing a borrowed gown and a necklace Grayson insisted she keep. She looked like someone from his world, but felt like a ghost drifting through it. When Grayson joined her, she didn't smile. She asked him if he really believed this could work, if he understood what people like his uncle saw when they looked at her. He told her he didn't care, that he didn't live for their approval, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, a hesitation, a weight. The next day they returned to the city, back to the noise and routine, but things were different, their conversations quieter, his touches more careful, and Eva knew something had changed, not just in him, but in her too. She started researching again, pulling up names she had avoided for years, records from the court case, old news articles, whispers of people who knew her mother, and she found something she hadn't expected. Her mother had once worked as a translator for a research team contracted by the military, a team funded by Wolf Dynamics. Her mother had died in an accident the year Eva turned 10, an accident Eva had been told was random, but now, reading between the lines, it didn't seem random at all. She confronted Grayson late one night, her voice calm but her hands shaking. She told him what she had found, how his company was listed in documents connected to the project her mother worked on, how she wanted to believe it was coincidence, but nothing about this felt accidental. Grayson didn't deny it. Instead, he sat down, silent, staring at his phone as if it might explain something. Finally, he told her that years ago, before he took over, Wolf Dynamics had been involved in dozens of covert programs, many of them sealed under national security. He said he didn't know the details of every project, but he promised to find out. Over the next few days, he pulled strings, demanded files, pushed past internal resistance until a folder landed on his desk, sealed and marked confidential. Inside were transcripts, reports, and one photo that made his blood run cold. A woman in a lab coat, smiling, standing beside his father. The caption read, "Maria Elena Carter, linguist and civilian contractor." He took the folder to Eva, didn't say anything, just handed it over. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning, hands trembling, and when she saw the photo, she collapsed into the nearest chair, Not because she didn't believe it, but because she always knew there was more to her mother's death than anyone told her. Grayson watched her, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to hold her to fix it. The other part knew he couldn't fix this, couldn't undo history. All he could do was be honest. He told her his father might have known more, might have buried things to protect the company, but if that were true, he would not protect him, not this time. Ava asked him what he would do, and he said he didn't know yet, but that he owed her the truth, all of it, even if it cost him everything. She didn't say thank you, didn't cry, she just nodded, and that nod meant more than 1,000 words, because it meant she wasn't walking away, not yet. But the past wasn't finished with them. One evening, Eva returned to her apartment to find the door slightly open. Inside, Mateo was safe but shaken. Someone had been there, files from her drawer were gone, and a message had been scrawled on the mirror in red lipstick. "Walk away while you can." She took Mateo and fled to a friend's house, called Grayson, told him everything, and within hours he had her moved into a private residence under security. He said it was standard protocol, but she knew better. Someone didn't want them digging into the past. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became, not just to their safety, but to their bond. Secrets began to pull at the threads between them. Eva feared what else might come to light. Grayson feared she would see him as the enemy, and beneath it all, the truth loomed like a storm neither of them could outrun. They still met in the quiet hours, still held each other like something fragile, still pretended for a little longer that love could protect them, but both knew deep down that love alone might not be enough. The snow had begun falling again, thick and heavy, coating the sidewalks of Manhattan in a pale quiet that felt deceptive, as if the city itself was trying to hide what was boiling underneath. Grayson stood in his office at the top of Wolf Tower, staring out the glass wall. The skyline spread before him like a battlefield. Below, the lights glittered like stars, but all he could think about was Eva, not the way she looked in borrowed gowns or how her voice softened when she said his name, but the way she sat across from him the night before, eyes guarded, jaw tense, fingers twisting nervously in her lap as she asked him if they were building something real or just leaning on each other because the world outside kept trying to burn them down. He had told her he didn't know yet, and that was the truth, not because he didn't care, but because caring was the easy part. Staying was harder. Staying meant making choices that left bruises, choices that made enemies out of blood, and shattered legacies that had taken lifetimes to build. The internal audit Grayson had demanded was nearly complete. A retired colonel had confirmed that Wolf Dynamics had funded the project Maria Carter worked on, not only funded but managed it. The paper trail had been deliberately buried, protected under national security clauses, but it was clear now that the research had included field testing on undocumented immigrants, and her death had not been an accident, but a silenced incident following a disagreement with senior military advisors. Grayson confronted his father directly, not in rage, but with a calm finality that scared even the elder Wolf. Gregory didn't deny the documents. Instead, he called it collateral, a necessary evil during a time of national need, and said if Grayson wanted to throw away the company over a woman who had been paid pennies to translate, then maybe he wasn't strong enough to carry the Wolf name. Grayson said nothing, just looked at the man who raised him, then turned and walked out of the room, deciding then and there that he would never be ruled by the same rot that had built their empire. He returned to Eva late that night. She had been waiting in the quiet apartment he arranged for her, curled up on the couch with a mug of untouched tea and Mateo asleep in the next room. She asked him what he found, and he told her everything. Not just the facts, but the ugliness behind them. His voice low, steady, refusing to sugarcoat any of it, and when he was done she stared at him for a long moment before asking, "What happens now?" When he said he was going public, that the company would release the files, accept responsibility, and pay reparations, she told him it would ruin him, and he said he knew. She told him it might not be enough, and he said it still had to be done. Because her mother deserved justice, because she deserved better, because sometimes the only way to fix something was to break it first. The next day, an anonymous leak appeared online, followed by a statement from Wolf Dynamics confirming the authenticity of the files and announcing an internal reform. The news exploded across media outlets. Investors panicked, shares dropped, board members demanded meetings. But Grayson stood firm. He gave press interviews, answered questions, and never once deflected blame. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "Because it was the right thing to do." Meanwhile, Ava was no longer hiding. She had applied to a university program for legal advocacy, hoping to turn her pain into something that could help others. She told Matteo the truth about their mother, held him when he cried, and promised they would never run again. Not from anyone. But darkness does not disappear just because you drag it into the light. And in the shadows of Grayson's actions, enemies began to stir. Former partners who lost money, insiders who feared exposure, and one man in particular who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Vincent Klein, a former defense contractor with ties to the same project Maria Carter had tried to stop, saw Grayson's move as a threat to everything they had buried. He sent a message, not with words but with violence. Grayson was scheduled to speak at a tech conference in Chicago, and his security team uncovered a credible threat just hours before the event. Eva begged him not to go, told him justice didn't have to mean martyrdom, but he said he wasn't going to hide. She stood at the airport gate and watched him board the plane, her chest tight, her fingers cold. A part of her wanted to run after him, to scream, to confess that she couldn't lose him now, not when she had finally let herself believe in something, but she stayed silent, afraid that if she said too much, it would make everything real. The bomb was small, built to look like an accident, placed in the service elevator of the hotel hosting the conference, but the plan failed, thanks to a whistleblower inside the security team who had seen the documents and decided enough was enough. The bomb was disabled, and the man responsible arrested before the keynote began. Grayson delivered his speech on stage, unshaken, firm, announcing a new initiative for corporate accountability and government partnerships. When the news broke, Eva was sitting in her apartment, clutching Matteo's hand and sobbing quietly, not just from fear but from relief, because for the first time in years, something good had survived. That night, Grayson came home, bruised from a minor scuffle but alive, and when he stepped through the door, Eva ran into him without hesitation. No more questions, no more fears. Just the warmth of two people who had almost lost each other too many times. In the weeks that followed, the world slowly shifted. The media frenzy faded, but the effects lingered. Wolf Dynamics lost several contracts but gained public trust, and Grayson, no longer the untouchable CEO, became a man people respected for his integrity rather than his inheritance. Eva enrolled in classes, worked part-time at a community legal aid center, and for the first time started writing about her story, not as a victim but as a survivor. Their nights were quieter now, filled with soft conversations and shared books, laughter that came more easily, and the comfort of knowing neither of them were pretending anymore. But beneath all that peace, something new had begun to grow, a secret Eva had carried for weeks, unsure of when to say it, how to say it, until one morning, over coffee and sunlight, she looked at him and said softly, "I think I'm pregnant." He didn't speak at first, just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he reached across the table, took her hand, and said, "Then we do this together. Whatever it takes, we do it together." And in that quiet promise, something larger than pain, larger than legacy, began to form. The days that followed Eva's quiet confession passed with a surreal stillness, the kind that came just before a storm. She had expected shock, perhaps even hesitation, but Grayson had responded with something far more dangerous, calm, the kind of calm that masked chaos beneath the surface. He held her hand, kissed her forehead, and told her they would figure everything out. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, not fear of fatherhood, but fear of failing at it. He had spent his life avoiding mess, managing risk, and now he stood on the edge of something no business plan could calculate. Eva could sense his worry, even when he tried to hide it behind spreadsheets and phone calls, and it unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. Meanwhile, she felt the changes in her body long before the tests confirmed it. The nausea came in waves, her fatigue deepened, and sometimes she found herself crying over nothing at all. She hated how vulnerable it made her feel, how much her independence now had to bend to biology. But she also couldn't help the small flicker of warmth that came every time she imagined a life growing inside her. Matteo was the first person they told. Together they waited until a Saturday afternoon, after he had finished his homework. Grayson knelt beside him, speaking carefully, telling him he was going to be an uncle. And for a moment there was only silence. Then Matteo grinned, not because he fully understood what it meant, but because the idea of family had always been a fragile, flickering dream in his life, and now it felt real. But the peace was temporary. A week later, Grayson received an anonymous tip about a hidden asset transfer connected to the Wolf Foundation, one that linked directly to a shell company owned by none other than Vincent Klein, the man behind the failed bombing. It became clear that Vincent had deeper ties to the Wolf family than anyone realized. Not just business, but blood. He was the illegitimate son of Grayson's grandfather, a secret buried for decades. Vincent had been cut out of the inheritance, raised in silence, and he had spent his life trying to dismantle the empire he believed had stolen what was his. The revelation hit Grayson hard, not just because of the betrayal, but because it meant that his family's corruption was deeper than he had imagined, and suddenly, the war he was fighting was no longer about justice for Eva's mother. It was about cleansing a bloodline that had rotted from the inside out. He didn't tell Eva everything at once, not because he wanted to lie, but because he didn't know how to say it, didn't know how to make her understand that the man who tried to kill him was, by blood, his uncle. She sensed the weight on his shoulders, the late nights, the sudden absences, and when she finally asked him what he was hiding, he told her the truth, every word. She didn't cry, didn't flinch. She just sat quietly, listening, then stood and walked away, locking herself in the bedroom, not out of anger, but because her heart couldn't hold it all at once. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker like tired stars, thinking about the child inside her, the life they were about to bring into a world built on lies and shadows. She had fought so hard to escape her past, and now she was tied to a legacy even more twisted. In the morning, Grayson found her still there, her eyes red, her skin pale, and he sat beside her, not speaking, just waiting. After a long silence, she told him she couldn't raise their child surrounded by ghosts. She needed clean air, real earth, not towers of glass and whispers in boardrooms. He nodded, knowing what she meant. Even before she said it, she wanted to leave the city. Within days, he made arrangements. A quiet property upstate, far from headlines and history, with trees older than their ancestors, and a porch that caught the morning sun. Eva didn't ask how he found it so fast, or how much it cost. She just packed their things and left without looking back. For a time, they found something close to peace. She spent her mornings walking barefoot in the grass, her afternoons reading to Matteo on the porch, and her evenings cooking meals that didn't come from takeout boxes. Grayson worked remotely, scaled back his hours, focused on smaller ventures with ethical roots, and for the first time, they began to dream out loud about names, colors for the nursery, and what it would mean to raise a child free of shame. But the past, as always, had other plans. One morning, while Eva was at a prenatal checkup in the nearby clinic, Grayson received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable. A young Eva, barely 15, standing beside a teenage boy with his hand around her wrist. The boy was Vincent's son, and the photo had been taken the week Eva reported her assault. Scrawled on the back were the words, "Your perfect girl has secrets too." Grayson's first instinct was disbelief, then anger. Not at her, but at the man who sent it, who had clearly been digging into her past. using trauma as a weapon. He didn't confront her immediately. He waited until she returned, watched her laugh with Matteo as they unpacked groceries, and realized he couldn't carry the photo in his pocket any longer. That night, he showed her. At first, she didn't speak, just stared, frozen. Then she touched the photo with trembling fingers, her breath catching in her throat, and slowly she told him everything. How that boy had been the first to hurt her, how she had tried to fight back but no one believed her, how the system failed her, and how she had buried it all so deep, hoping it would never follow her into the life she was trying to build. She thought he would walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he took her hands and said the words he had never said to anyone. "I love you, not because you survived, but because you never stopped trying. And I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Eva broke, not with fear or shame, but with the overwhelming weight of being believed, being seen, and she cried in his arms until the past no longer had the strength to stand between them. That weekend, they drove to the riverbank near the edge of the property, dug a small hole, and buried the photo beneath an oak tree. No speeches, no grand gestures, just silence, and the quiet promise that their future would not be written by the ones who tried to erase them. They stood there long after the wind picked up, holding hands, knowing that pain would always be part of their story, but it would never again be the ending. Spring arrived slowly in the Hudson Valley, soft and green and full of second chances. The trees outside their porch bloomed one by one, birds returned with quiet songs, and the world for once seemed to exhale. Eva moved more carefully now, her belly round and full of life. Every morning she stood by the kitchen window, hands resting just below her ribs, watching the wind play with the wildflowers. Some days she still carried the weight of the past in her chest, but it no longer felt sharp, just distant, like a storm that had already passed. She had stopped asking if she deserved this kind of happiness, because she realized the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that she had chosen it. Grayson spent his mornings fixing small things around the house, things that didn't need fixing but gave his hands purpose. In the afternoons, he worked on a non-profit fund dedicated to supporting victims of wrongful prosecution and underrepresented legal cases. It was Eva's idea. But he insisted she be co-founder. She tried to argue, but he reminded her that her story was not just pain, it was power, and if they were going to raise a child in a world full of broken systems, they would at least teach that child what it meant to try and change something. Matteo adjusted faster than anyone expected. He made friends at the local school, brought home drawings of the family with uneven smiles and bright suns, and called the baby Bean, until the nickname stuck. Eva taught him how to bake from scratch. Grayson taught him chess, and together they taught him that family was not built from blood or law but from choice. One quiet Sunday, with the clouds rolling slow above the hills and the scent of cinnamon in the kitchen, Eva went into labor. There was no panic, just a steady rhythm of breath and movement. Grayson stayed by her side, his voice the anchor she needed. Hours passed like minutes, and when the child arrived, their daughter was placed in Eva's arms, red and soft and wailing like the world had dared to keep her waiting. Eva cried quietly, not from pain, but from something deeper, the love so big it made her chest ache. Grayson stood over them, one hand on Eva's shoulder, the other gently cradling the tiny foot of the life they had created. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not legacy, not bloodlines, not headlines, just them. They named her Elena, after the woman who had given Eva everything and lost everything in return. And when Eva whispered the name against her daughter's forehead, she felt a peace she had never known. Grayson leaned down and said, "Welcome home, little light." And Eva knew in her bones that the world would never be the same again. Months passed, then years, the house filled with memories, birthdays with lopsided cakes, mornings of laughter and coffee and soft music, long walks under the changing leaves, and every once in a while, when the stars were out and the children asleep, Grayson and Eva would sit on the back porch, shoulders touching, hands intertwined, and talk about how far they had come. Not just from the city, or the scandal, or the pain, but from the versions of themselves that had once been afraid to believe in love. One night, as fireflies danced in the distance and the air smelled of wet earth, Eva said softly, "Do you think we were meant to find each other?" And Grayson replied without hesitation, "I don't think the universe gives you what you want. I think it gives you what you're strong enough to fight for. And you, Eva, were worth every battle." She smiled, leaned into him, and whispered, "Then let's never stop fighting for it." And in the stillness that followed, with the moon high and the world quiet, two people who had once been broken sat side by side, whole at last, not because they were perfect, but because they had chosen love again and again, even when it hurt, even when it scared them, and that was more than enough.